One summer, San Francisco was gripped by fear. Neighbors, families, and friends seemed to vanish without a trace. The police were baffled, and every unanswered question only deepened the terror spreading through the Bay Area. Then the investigation took a horrifying turn when a killing ground was uncovered high in the California mountains. As the number of victims continued to rise, the evidence began pointing toward an elusive killer hiding behind layers of lies, stolen identities, and silence. To bring him to justice, a small-town prosecutor would have to take a long, dark journey into the mind of a serial killer. Years later, one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in California history finally began. The investigation had stretched across many years, and the case file had grown into a massive mountain of evidence. The responsibility of prosecuting one of California's most notorious killers fell to Everett Price, the district attorney of Calaveras County. A prosecutor's job is to seek justice, Price believed. Many people thought prosecutors existed only to convict and send people to prison, but to him, the duty was deeper than that. His responsibility was to make sure the criminal justice system was carried out fairly and that justice, above all else, was pursued. The chain of events began with what seemed like a simple shoplifting call. A South San Francisco dispatcher received a report that a theft was taking place at South City Lumber. Officer Travis Reed responded. He had been on the street for only a short time, and like any young officer, his first thought was safety. Even the simplest call could turn dangerous in an instant. A witness told Reed that he had seen an Asian man stealing a table vise worth less than $100. When confronted, the man had tossed the vise into the trunk of a brown Honda and fled on foot. Inside the Honda, Reed noticed a suspicious case. When he opened it, he found a Ruger pistol fitted with a cylindrical object. Based on his training, Reed recognized the attachment as a silencer. The gun had been illegally modified. As Reed examined it, an agitated man came out of the store and insisted that he had paid for the item his friend had taken. Reed's supervisor, Sergeant Grant Mercer, soon arrived. The gun made both officers suspicious, and the car was impounded. The man was handcuffed and taken to the station so he could give a statement about the weapon. On the way there, he told Sergeant Mercer that the shoplifter's name was Darren Kwan. Mercer radioed dispatch for a background check. The response was alarming. Kwan was a former Marine born in Hong Kong. He had been convicted in military court for stealing automatic weapons from a military base and had once escaped from a military prison. At the South San Francisco police station, the man in custody was placed in a secure holding room. He identified himself as Nolan Hale. He admitted that he was a fugitive from justice and said he was willing to make a statement. First, he asked for a piece of paper, a pencil, and a glass of water. Sergeant Mercer left the room to summon Detective Dale Hopper, the on-call detective. When they returned, Hale was on the floor convulsing violently. Hopper called paramedics. Hale was thrashing uncontrollably, like a fish out of water, and no one understood what was happening. They did not know whether he was suffering a seizure or something else entirely. At the hospital, doctors later determined that there was no brain activity. Hale was brain dead. An autopsy revealed that he had swallowed capsules containing cyanide. Medical staff explained that the gel capsule would have taken time to dissolve before the poison entered his system, which matched the time between the lumberyard and the police station. Instead of writing a statement, Hale had written a note to a woman named Marin. It read, "Dear Marin, I love you. I forgive you. Freedom is better than all else. I'm sorry, Mom, Nora, and everyone. I'm sorry for all the trouble. Love, Nolan." Police were confused. Why had this man taken his own life over a shoplifting arrest and an illegal weapon? Whatever secrets Nolan Hale had carried, he had taken them to the grave. The answer might have rested with Hale's companion, Darren Kwan. Police issued a warrant for Kwan's arrest for shoplifting and then processed the car Hale had been driving. When investigators ran the serial number on the Honda's engine block, they discovered that the vehicle belonged to Wade Ralston, a Bay Area man who had been missing for months. Detective Alara Brooks of the San Francisco Police Department had investigated Ralston's disappearance. His sister had reported him missing after he failed to show up for dinner with his girlfriend, who lived in the same apartment building. Ralston had planned to show a car he was selling through a newspaper advertisement. After that, he vanished. Ralston's case was not the only strange disappearance in the Bay Area. Detective Brooks was also investigating the disappearance of an entire family. San Francisco police had responded to a frantic call after Parker Marsh, his wife Audrey, and their young son Rowan had not been seen for days. Officers had to climb through a window to enter the family's apartment. Inside, it was clear something was terribly wrong. The family had disappeared and there were signs of a struggle. Parker had recently placed an advertisement in the newspaper to rent out his video equipment. That equipment was now missing. Missing person cases often followed certain patterns. Many involved teenage runaways or adults who disappeared briefly and returned later. But the Marsh family's apartment told a different story. Audrey's medication, something she needed every day, had been left behind. The baby's room was in disorder. Their cats had been left locked inside without care, something the family would never have done voluntarily. Detective Brooks feared they would never return. It was unusual for people like Wade Ralston or the Marsh family to vanish without a trace. With no strong leads, both cases had gone cold. At first, the only obvious similarity between them was a newspaper ad. But once Ralston's Honda was found in Nolan Hale's possession, Brooks and her partner reopened the case and searched the vehicle. Inside, they found a driver's license belonging to a man named Callan Staley. They also found a stun gun and several unspent bullets on the floor. Beneath the passenger seat was an electric bill addressed to a woman named Marin Vale. In the roof of the car, investigators found a single bullet hole. The trajectory showed that the shot had been fired from the back seat. When investigators sprayed luminol inside the vehicle, traces of blood appeared. High-velocity blood spatter, the kind associated with a gunshot wound, showed on the roof near the front passenger seat. Detective Brooks and her partner now suspected they would never find Wade Ralston alive. With Nolan Hale dead and Darren Kwan missing, investigators could only wonder how many more victims might be waiting at the end of this trail of blood. Hale's mysterious suicide had now triggered a full-scale investigation. Brooks and her partner drove to the home of Hale's mother, who lived outside San Francisco. There they were surprised to find Marin Vale, the woman whose name appeared on the electric bill in Ralston's car. Marin was Hale's ex-wife. They had been married for several years before divorcing. Detectives suspected she might be the woman named in Hale's suicide note. They asked how a bill in her name had ended up in Wade Ralston's car. Marin explained that the address on the bill was for a cabin her family owned in Calaveras County, in Northern California. Brooks and her partner wanted to search the cabin immediately, but Marin claimed she was too busy to take them there until the following day. The detectives postponed the search and instructed her not to visit the property before then. They also contacted the Calaveras County Sheriff's Department and asked if deputies could keep an eye on the property. Calaveras County covered a vast stretch of rugged terrain, and only a small number of officers protected the entire area. The sheriff sent 2 deputies to check the cabin, located outside a small mountain town. A metal gate blocked the driveway, and because manpower was limited, the deputies could not remain there continuously. They made passing checks instead. The next morning, Brooks and her partner arranged to meet Marin outside the local post office. They were surprised when she arrived with Hale's mother. Then Marin admitted that the 2 women had gone to the cabin the night before. She claimed they had gone only because Hale had been untidy and they wanted to clean the place. Concerned that Marin and Hale's mother might have disturbed evidence, Brooks, her partner, and Calaveras County deputies followed them to the property. The detectives asked Marin about a cinderblock bunker near the cabin. She said she did not have the key and refused to give permission to search it. Without enough probable cause for a warrant, investigators had to limit their search to the cabin itself. At that point, they were still most interested in getting inside the house. Since the search was based on consent, they did not want to antagonize Marin and risk losing access. While her partner questioned Marin, Detective Brooks searched the cabin. She noticed something strange about the bed. Holes had been drilled into the bedposts and the floor, as if the bed had been designed to restrain someone. Then, while standing near a bookcase, Brooks turned and recognized a piece of video equipment. Suddenly, she remembered where she had seen it before. It matched equipment stolen from Parker Marsh, the San Francisco man who had vanished with his family. Brooks called her office and asked someone to check the Marsh inventory and read the serial number. When the number matched, investigators realized the case was much bigger than Wade Ralston. Now the Marsh family was connected too. At that moment, Marin became nervous and told the investigators they had been there long enough. She wanted them to leave. To learn what other secrets the isolated cabin held, Brooks would need a search warrant. Investigators left the property, but this time they made sure the cabin would be secured until they returned. The discovery of Parker Marsh's video equipment gave investigators enough probable cause to ask a judge for a warrant. Ron Beckett led the investigation for the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office. Once the warrant was granted, investigators returned to search the residence, the property, and what first appeared to be a tool shed. The tool shed was actually a cinder block structure near the driveway. Marin had called it a fallout shelter. Nolan Hale had been a survivalist, and this bunker had been his fortress against nuclear disaster. As the heavy door opened, investigators could only wonder what they would find inside. On the walls were photographs of young women, many in various stages of undress. Some were nude. Investigators did not know who the women were or where the pictures had been taken. Everyone feared the photographs might be trophies, the kind serial killers sometimes keep of their victims. They also found a journal written by Nolan Hale. In it, he wrote about a novel involving a butterfly collector who captures a young woman and keeps her prisoner. Hale wrote of carrying a similar fantasy for nearly his entire adult life. In other entries, he referred to a series of plans under the heading, The Miranda Project. Investigators could only speculate about what the phrase meant, but it sounded deeply ominous. About 100 yards from the bunker, Ron Beckett and the other investigators noticed several burn sites. The ground had been scarred by multiple fires. As they examined the ash, they found fragments that appeared to be bone. At first, they were not certain whether the remains were human, but the possibility was horrifying. If the ashes contained human bone, then someone had tried to conceal an unspeakable crime. Desperate for answers, investigators checked the license plates of a truck parked near the cabin. It belonged to Garrett Cole, one of Hale's neighbors. Cole had lived with his wife, Mira, and their young son in a house nearby. Officers walked next door to speak with them. No one answered. Inside, the smell of decaying food filled the air. The house appeared to have been empty for a long time. It looked as though the occupants had left abruptly, but there were no obvious signs of violence. They had simply disappeared. Another vehicle found on Hale's property belonged to Callan Staley, whose driver's license had been discovered in Wade Ralston's car. Investigators learned that Hale had been using Staley's license because the two men had a similar build, allowing Hale to pass himself off under another identity. When authorities checked on Staley, they discovered that he had also been living near the cabin and had not been seen. The search intensified. Cadaver dogs were brought in to help. Authorities now suspected that several missing people from Northern California were connected to the cabin. If they had been murdered, police feared their bodies might be buried on the property. One of the dogs recovered a piece of bone. Deputies immediately knew it was not from an animal. With the discovery of human remains, what had begun as a missing person investigation became a homicide case. Investigators declared Nolan Hale's property a crime scene and assembled a task force to process the cabin and surrounding land. Because the case was expanding so rapidly, the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office called for additional help. Specialists from the San Francisco Police Department and the California Department of Justice arrived to assist. Law enforcement vehicles descended on the property. Now that it was a murder investigation, police understood that every item recovered could become vital in a future prosecution. The property was divided into sections, and each team was assigned a specific area. In a clearing near the cabin, officers found a trench filled with loose dirt. Inside were personal belongings and debris. Sergeant Larry Blevins of the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office helped search for clues. Every button, zipper, piece of jewelry, and small object was collected, photographed, and cataloged. There were hundreds of items. Investigators collected everything that might possibly be used by either the prosecution or the defense. Survival gear, supplies, and personal effects from the bunker were gathered and sent to the sheriff's office. There, every item was carefully logged. Investigators hoped that somewhere in that vast collection of evidence, they would find the clue that could unravel the mysteries hidden on Hale's land. During the search of the bunker, investigators made a shocking discovery. Behind shelves inside the structure was a secret door. At first, it looked like an ordinary shelving unit, but when officers moved it, the door popped open. Beyond it was another door leading to a hidden room. Inside was a cramped chamber containing a homemade wooden cot, a crude shelf with toiletries, and a roll of toilet paper. A small hole had been cut high in the wall, possibly for ventilation. A typed list of rules was attached to one wall. The rules demanded absolute obedience, submission, silence, and service to a master. From outside the chamber, investigators could see inside through a two-way mirror. They also noticed that the door hinges had been bent, as though someone inside had pushed desperately to escape. Remembering Hale's journal, investigators feared he had acted on his fantasy of kidnapping and imprisoning a human being. Forensic specialists dusted for fingerprints and searched for any sign that a captive had been kept there. They found nothing. Outside, the search continued. Near the driveway, an investigator noticed loose soil and discovered a buried plastic container. As darkness fell, the task force suspended the outdoor search. Inside the cabin, investigators played one of the videotapes found in the buried container. They could hardly believe what appeared on the screen. The case had grown more frightening with every discovery, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see. After days of searching Hale's cabin, investigators feared that many people had been killed and possibly buried on the property. The videotape showed two women being subjected to extreme verbal and psychological abuse by Nolan Hale and his accomplice, who demanded submission under threats of violence. An Asian man appeared on the tape holding a knife and cutting away a woman's clothing. Investigators identified him as Darren Kwan, the shoplifter Hale had named shortly before taking his own life. The Homicide Division of the San Francisco Police Department launched a full-scale manhunt for Kwan. Investigators began by searching his San Francisco apartment. They collected video equipment and additional videotapes, tagging each item as evidence and sending it for analysis. Detective Ed Mallory led the task force investigating the disappearance of the Marsh family. The equipment used by Hale and Kwan to record their captives had once belonged to Parker Marsh. Investigators also showed neighbors a photo lineup, and one neighbor identified Kwan as one of the men seen leaving the Marsh home. One of the men had been carrying a large duffel bag. That eyewitness identification gave investigators probable cause for an arrest warrant. Maren Vale, Nolan Hale's ex-wife, was questioned about Hale's relationship with Darren Kwan. She agreed to talk only after her attorney secured immunity from prosecution. Maren claimed she knew nothing about the murders. She did tell investigators that after the shoplifting incident, Kwan had walked to her house. The two drove back to the lumber yard to see whether Hale was all right. When they saw him speaking with police, they returned to Maren's house and waited, expecting Hale to call from custody. When he did not call, Maren drove Kwan to his apartment. Kwan told her he needed to leave town. She said he had mentioned Chicago as a possible destination and claimed that was the last time she saw him. Because Kwan was wanted for murder and may have fled the state, California investigators asked the FBI for assistance. At the airport, agents learned that a man matching Kwan's description had boarded a flight to Chicago using a false name. In Chicago, agents worked to track his movements and began an extensive background investigation. Kwan had been born in Hong Kong and had entered the United States on a student visa. He later enlisted in the Marine Corps, but was arrested for stealing weapons. After escaping from prison, he hid with Nolan Hale and Maren Vale on the advice of a friend. At the same time, federal agents had been building a case against Hale for illegal firearms. Hale and Kwan were both arrested, but Hale skipped bail and became a fugitive. Kwan returned to prison to finish his sentence. After his release, he went back to the San Francisco Bay Area, where Maren picked him up at the airport and reunited him with Hale. Kwan was an experienced fugitive with a wide network of friends. To develop more leads, the FBI placed him on its most wanted list. agents focused on his friends and acquaintances in the Chicago area. Meanwhile, the body count in Calaveras County continued to rise. Not far from Hale's cabin, investigators unearthed 2 intact bodies wrapped in sleeping bags. Coroner Terry Alden was on the scene. The remains were badly decomposed, and it was difficult to tell whether the victims were male or female. Both appeared to have been gagged and handcuffed. A San Francisco medical examiner later determined that both victims were men who had been shot to death. Dental records identified them as Hale's neighbors, Garrett Cole and Callan Staley. In Chicago, the FBI finally got its first lead. Agents learned that after prison, Quan had stayed in touch with a former cellmate. That man described driving Quan first to Detroit and then to a border town where they separated. Another witness came forward and said he had seen Quan board a bus bound for Toronto. Agents knew Quan had a sister there. The FBI placed her apartment under surveillance, but Quan never appeared. After days of searching, the trail went cold. The suspected serial killer was now somewhere in Canada. As news of the murders spread, media crews descended on the property in Calaveras County. The case became known across California, then across the United States, and even in Canada. Investigators allowed reporters onto the property. They showed them portions of the crime scene and some of the evidence recovered. The images were haunting. Bone fragments scattered across the land, burn sites, and remnants of lives destroyed. The California Conservation Corps was brought in to help gather bones, many workers crawling on their hands and knees, raking the soil with their fingers. Investigators recovered pounds of bone fragments. Authorities believed there could be many more victims buried or burned on the property. They hoped media coverage would help identify the young women whose photographs had been found on the bunker wall. A telephone hotline was set up by the sheriff's department and calls began pouring in. Investigators believed Nolan Hale and Darren Quan had crossed paths with many people who were later reported missing. Under Detective Mallory's direction, the task force tried to piece together leads that might locate Quan or identify the growing list of victims. Anyone connected to Hale or Quan was tracked down. If they were alive, investigators asked about their relationship to the men. If they were missing, their names were added to the grim puzzle. Family and friends of the missing were shown photographs of personal belongings recovered from the property. They feared their loved ones might be among the dead. There was the Marsh family from San Francisco, who had placed an ad to rent video equipment and then disappeared. There was Silas Vance, a friend of Hale, found buried behind the cabin. There were Camden Rourke and Bryce Fallon, who worked with Quan at a moving company and vanished together. There was Archer Sloan, Quan's longtime friend, and Archer's girlfriend, Cassidy Blair. There were Hale's neighbors Garrett Cole, Mira Cole, their young child Owen, and their friend Callan Staley. And there was Wade Ralston, whose car had first led investigators down this trail of kidnapping and murder. Then the task force received one piece of good news. The women in the photographs were identified, and all of them were still alive. It was a relief, but Hale's property still held too many mysteries. Agents feared they would never know the complete truth unless they found Darren Quan. After weeks of searching, a boy riding his bicycle in a Canadian park discovered what he thought would be the perfect place for a play fort. Instead, he saw a man living there. The boy recognized him from wanted posters and told police he had found someone who looked like Darren Quan. He led officers to the makeshift shelter, but Quan had already fled. Later that same day, Quan made the same kind of mistake that had started the investigation in the first place. A security guard confronted a young Asian man slipping stolen merchandise into a knapsack at a department store in Calgary. During the struggle, the man shot the guard in the hand. The guard still managed to wrestle the weapon away and hold him until police arrived. Darren Quan had finally been captured. He was booked on charges of attempted murder, robbery, and possession of a firearm. News of his arrest reached the sheriff's office in Calaveras County. San Francisco Inspector Ed Mallory flew to Calgary, where Quan was being held in a maximum security prison. Mallory spent hours with him. Quan spoke, but most of his answers were short denials. He claimed the murders were all Nolan Hale's doing. When pressed, Quan admitted that he had helped Hale dispose of the bodies of Garrett Cole and Callan Staley after they were murdered. In Calaveras County, the district attorney's office indicted Quan on multiple counts of first-degree murder. making it possible for prosecutors to seek the death penalty. But Kwan's flight to Canada created a major obstacle. Under the extradition treaty between the United States and Canada, Canada would not return a suspect to face the death penalty unless specific legal requirements were met. Before extradition could begin, Kwan had to stand trial in Canada on the shoplifting and assault charges. To delay his return, he waived his right to a jury trial and requested a bench trial. He received a lengthy sentence. Until that sentence was complete, the Calaveras County District Attorney could not begin the complicated extradition process. While the District Attorney's office built its case, the search for evidence continued at Nolan Hale's cabin. By then, several bodies had been found and identified. Hundreds of personal effects had been recovered. Many pounds of unidentified human remains had been unearthed. Investigators believed that many missing people were linked to the cabin. As the evidence against Kwan grew, he used his time in a Canadian prison to fight extradition. He knew that if he returned to the United States, he would face a murder trial and the possibility of a death sentence. He began teaching himself the American legal system. For a man with limited formal education, raised in Hong Kong, Kwan proved remarkably skilled at understanding legal procedure and using it to his advantage. A prison guard reported overhearing him tell another inmate that if someone wanted to delay the system, he only had to fire his lawyers. Eventually, the extradition hearings began. Kwan lost and appealed all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. His appeal was denied, and he was placed on a plane back to California. But the pursuit of justice was far from over. Kwan had used his time in Canada to arm himself with enough legal knowledge to wage war on the American court system. When Kwan finally returned to California, the Calaveras County District Attorney charged him with multiple counts of murder. Detective Sergeant Randy Greer transported him from the California Department of Corrections to the Calaveras County Courthouse. Security was intense. Officers had heard that someone might try to kill Kwan, and the sheriff's department did not want to lose him after everything it had taken to bring him back. Calaveras County was not prepared to handle a prisoner like Darren Kwan. The courthouse was not secure enough for a maximum security inmate, so the county had to build a special cage to hold him during legal proceedings. From the moment Kwan arrived, he seemed determined to create chaos and delay. He tried to fire his attorneys, he complained about his treatment. He filed motions demanding better food, a shorter commute from prison, and the removal of the courtroom cage. Each motion drained the limited resources of the small district attorney's office. Everett Price later reflected on how massive the case truly was. His office was tiny, with only a handful of attorneys, investigators, and support staff. It was more like a small law firm than an office equipped for one of the largest criminal cases in California history. The prosecution battled Kwan for a long time before the preliminary hearing even began. The purpose of that hearing was simply to decide whether there was enough evidence to try him for the murders. The prosecution had little direct evidence connecting Kwan to the killings. There were no eyewitnesses to the murders, few fingerprints, and limited blood evidence. Their case would have to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. Their strongest evidence was the videotape found at the cabin, labeled with a title referring to the women. At the preliminary hearing, the tape was played publicly for the first time. On it, Hale and Kwan were seen torturing two women. One of them was Mira Cole, who lived on the neighboring property with her partner, their baby, and a friend. On the tape, Mira was handcuffed and begging Hale and Kwan to give her baby back. She cried for her child. Investigators knew the baby had been killed. The footage was heartbreaking and devastating. The tapes were incriminating, but because physical evidence linking Kwan directly to the murders was limited, prosecutors also relied on testimony from another criminal. Nolan Graves had served time with Kwan in Canada. To pass the time, Kwan had drawn crude cartoons depicting his crimes and told Graves stories about what had happened at Hale's cabin. Hoping to gain favor with his parole board, Graves turned over the drawings and told authorities what Kwan had confessed. One of the most damning drawings depicted Kwan killing a baby. Graves testified at Kwan's extradition hearing and described everything Kwan had told him. The testimony became critical evidence. The court eventually found enough grounds to try Darren Kwan on the murder charges. Once Kwan knew he would stand trial, he began doing everything possible to delay the proceedings. He filed a motion claiming his court-appointed attorneys were incompetent. He succeeded in firing them, and the court appointed new counsel. Because pre-trial publicity made it impossible to find an impartial jury in Calaveras County, Kwan's new defense team asked to move the trial. The judge agreed, transferring the case to Orange County in Southern California. A huge truck delivered an enormous amount of case material to Kwan's new defense team. It included hundreds of boxes of court records, witness testimony, investigative reports, medical reports, police reports, and thousands of evidence photographs. Sterling Ward, Kwan's court-appointed attorney, received years to prepare the defense. The prosecution moved hundreds of miles south to Orange County and prepared for the biggest case of their careers. The years of delay worried Everett Price. In any case, memories fade, witnesses die, and evidence becomes harder to present. Adding years to the life of a criminal case made prosecution far more difficult. As both sides prepared for trial, Kwan again tried to delay the process. But Judge Warren Blake finally put a stop to the tactics. The case was going to trial. The prosecution team from Calaveras County worked with Vivian Hart, the Deputy Attorney General for the state of California. Everett Price regarded her as both a tremendous lawyer and a deeply principled person. In many ways, she became the heart and soul of the prosecution. Just as prosecutors prepared for jury selection, they suffered a devastating setback. Nolan Graves, the inmate who claimed Kwan had confessed, was killed in a car accident after his release. He had been the only person to whom Kwan had described the crimes in detail. The prosecution had lost a key witness. Many years had passed since investigators began finding bodies at the mountain cabin. Although they had linked numerous missing people to Hale's property, they had enough evidence to charge Kwan with only a limited number of murders. He had managed to delay his trial for more than a decade, but he could delay no longer. The murder trial of Darren Kwan was finally about to begin. Because the case was expected to last so long, attorneys had to question a large pool of potential jurors about whether they could commit the necessary time. During jury selection, Kwan became agitated. He shouted obscenities and tried to stop the proceedings, telling the judge he did not want a trial. Judge Blake ordered Kwan to wear an electric stun belt for the rest of the trial. If he became violent again, a bailiff could activate the device by remote control. After a lengthy selection process, the lawyers chose a jury of 8 women and 4 men, along with alternates. To protect their identities, each juror was assigned a number. The trial began with opening statements. For both sides, the opening statement served as a map, telling the jury what each side intended to prove and how they planned to prove it. After years of waiting, Vivian Hart stood to speak for the prosecution. She told the jury that the evidence would show Darren Kwan and Nolan Hale had planned and committed the murders together. She described how the victims disappeared from the face of the earth and promised the trial would reveal what had happened to them. Hart described the Calaveras County property as a killing field and a mass graveyard. She told the jury about the videotape found buried near the cabin, which showed Kwan demanding submission from Cassidy Blair and cutting the clothes from Mira Cole. The videotape became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. It showed the jury who Darren Kwan was, a man who not only tortured women but recorded his acts so he could relive them. For the prosecutors, it was the most incriminating and emotionally powerful evidence they had ever used. The terror in the victims' faces was impossible to ignore. Because the tape was the strongest physical evidence connecting Kwan to the murders, the prosecution planned to use it throughout the trial. Sterling Ward, Kwan's court-appointed attorney, barely focused on his client during much of his opening statement. His strategy was to shift blame from Darren Kwan to the late Nolan Hale. Ward argued that Hale had the motive, the plan, and the fantasy that drove the crimes. He pointed to Hale's diary and the Miranda Project. He read excerpts to the jury and suggested that Hale's true conspirator was not Kwan, but Marin Vale, Hale's ex-wife. He argued that she knew about the plan and may have recruited potential victims. Ward stressed that no witness would come into court, point at Kwan, and say they saw him murder anyone. With little physical evidence placing Kwan at the killings, The defense intended to attack the prosecution's circumstantial case and argue that Hale alone was responsible. The prosecution called Sergeant Larry Blevins of the Calaveras County Sheriff's Department. He testified about a startling discovery he made while analyzing videotapes seized from Quan's San Francisco apartment. One tape appeared to be an ordinary recording. When Blevins rewound it without stopping at first, he suddenly saw a still image at the end, two bodies in a wheelbarrow. The image was entered into evidence. A medical examiner compared the image to photographs of bodies found at the cabin. He identified the remains as those of Callan Staley and Garrett Cole. He explained how the men had been bound, gagged, and wrapped in sleeping bags. The sleeping bags matched those shown on the tape. The medical examiner testified that the bodies in the image appeared to be in full rigor mortis, which occurs shortly after death before decomposition begins. In Canada, Quan had told Inspector Mallory that he helped bury Cole and Staley after they were murdered. Whoever recorded that image had done so soon after the killings. That single frame from a videotape found in Quan's apartment linked him directly to the murders of Garrett Cole and Callan Staley. Because so few remains from the property could be identified, prosecutors relied on hundreds of personal effects found at Quan's apartment and Hale's cabin to connect Quan to the victims. The items were photographed and entered into evidence. Mitch Harmon, the district attorney's lead investigator, coordinated witness testimony for the prosecution. The prosecution presented hundreds of pieces of evidence and called witnesses from across the United States and Canada to prove that the recovered items belonged to missing people and victims in the case. The prosecution next attempted to connect Cassidy Blair to Darren Quan. Cassidy was one of the women shown on the tape being tortured by Hale and Quan. Her body was never found, but several of her personal belongings were discovered near the cabin. Her sister was asked to identify a heart-shaped pendant. It was a necklace Cassidy had worn constantly. The necklace was entered into evidence. Prosecutors then built the timeline of Cassidy's disappearance. Her former supervisor described a strange phone call Cassidy received at work. Cassidy said her boyfriend, Archer Sloan, had been shot and that she wanted to go to him. Archer had met Darren Quan while serving time in federal prison. Archer allegedly called Cassidy and said he was wounded in Lake Tahoe. He told her he was sending a friend to pick her up. Cassidy asked her supervisor for time off. A man arrived in a brown or bronze Honda. The supervisor remembered him as bald, bearded, and older. Prosecutors then played the videotape of Cassidy's ordeal. Investigators explained that Cassidy was brought into the cabin, handcuffed, and seated in a chair. She was told that if she did not cooperate, she would be tied to the bed, assaulted, taken outside, shot, and buried where Archer had already been buried. Cassidy was never seen or heard from again. Her manager later received a typewritten letter claiming Cassidy had found work in Lake Tahoe and did not intend to return. Many victims' families, friends, and co-workers received similar typewritten letters explaining sudden disappearances. Forensic document examiners compared the letters and determined they had all been written on the same typewriter. An Olympia typewriter found inside Hale's cabin matched the letters, and prosecutors entered it into evidence. The prosecution then tried to prove that Darren Quan was responsible for the abduction and murder of the Marsh family. They called Karen Bell, a friend of Audrey Marsh. Karen testified about the last time she spoke to Audrey on the phone. Audrey had said someone was coming to see Parker about the video equipment. Then the doorbell rang and the call ended. Parker Marsh, a part-time wedding photographer, had placed a newspaper ad offering to rent his video equipment. Karen tried calling Audrey again later, but no one answered. Parker, Audrey, and their young son Rowan vanished from their San Francisco home. Their bodies were never found. Detective Alara Brooks testified that Parker was meticulous with his records. He kept receipts, serial numbers, brand names, and photographs of his equipment. Those detailed records allowed investigators to trace his video equipment to Nolan Hale's cabin. Some of the equipment was also found in Darren Quan's apartment, and one piece matched Parker's inventory. Since the Marsh family's bodies were never recovered, the prosecution relied on overwhelming circumstantial evidence to tie Quan to their disappearance. A case, prosecutors explained, is like a puzzle. Each piece must be placed carefully so the jury can see the larger picture. To prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt, enough pieces must fit together. Sergeant Blevins returned to the stand and testified about the burn sites on the property. He described the hundreds of bone fragments found there, many of them crushed, burned, and scattered. Based on the size and number of burn sites, investigators suspected Hale and Kwan had used fire to destroy the bodies of many victims. The condition of the remains made it impossible to identify everyone. No one had witnessed the murders, but prosecutors had one more powerful move. Since Nolan Graves had died before trial, they asked to have the transcript of his earlier Canadian testimony read into the record. The defense objected strongly, but the judge allowed the transcript. Sergeant Raymond Monroe of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police took the stand and read Graves's prior testimony. In it, Graves described how Kwan gave him grotesque cartoons and spoke about the crimes, including the videotaped abuse of Cassidy Blair and Mira Cole. Graves said Kwan told him that a woman on the tape complained that it was too warm and that Kwan used a butterfly knife to cut her clothes off. And that Kwan used a Graves had been a career criminal with convictions for robbery and sexual assault. On cross-examination, Sterling Ward attacked his credibility. Ward emphasized Graves's criminal history and the fact that he had received money and protection as part of an agreement with Canadian authorities. Ward implied that Graves had been paid for his testimony and would say anything for money. The attack was effective. The prosecution's key witness was dead, and the defense had cast doubt on the words he left behind. After presenting its case, the prosecution rested. Sterling Ward then began Darren Kwan's defense. His strategy was simple. Convince the jury that Nolan Hale was the real killer and Kwan was merely a bystander. Ward called several women to the stand. Each testified about disturbing encounters with Hale. They described his interest in bondage, lurid photography, and fantasies involving violence and death. One woman had a long relationship with Hale and had posed for numerous photographs before leaving because of his frightening fantasies. Another testified that Hale had threatened her and spoken about human sacrifice. The testimony painted Hale as the monster and established that none of these witnesses had met Darren Kwan. Other witnesses testified that they had seen Kwan acting more like Hale's assistant or helper, supporting the defense theory that Kwan was subservient to Hale. Ward also called witnesses who had seen Marin Vale at the cabin, trying to suggest that she, not Kwan, had been Hale's accomplice. The defense also attempted to show that Kwan spent little time at Hale's property. The defense's strongest evidence that Hale planned the kidnappings and murders was his journal, where he described the Miranda Project. While the jury was out of the courtroom, Ward tried to enter an edited version of the journal into evidence, but because that version removed references to Darren Kwan, the judge resisted. The court ruled that the edited diary could mislead the jury into thinking Hale acted alone. Ward's attempt to put Nolan Hale on trial had been blocked, but he countered with another move. In his opening statement, Ward had claimed that Marin Vale knew about the Miranda Project and helped Hale recruit women to photograph. He believed she had played a much bigger role than she admitted, and suggested she was Hale's true accomplice. The prosecution had not called her as a witness. When Marin took the stand, everyone in the courtroom, including the prosecution, waited to hear what she would say. Instead, Ward read her immunity agreement aloud. The agreement protected Marin from prosecution for crimes related to the victims, including murder, conspiracy, aiding and abetting, theft, and receiving stolen property. Then Ward asked her no questions. It was a stunning move. By doing nothing, he created the impression that Marin had something to hide. Because she had not testified substantively, the prosecution could not cross-examine her. Marin had made an immunity deal with prosecutors, but in the end, she gave them little and became more useful to the defense. Ward then presented another witness who could not be cross-examined, Nolan Hale himself. He played a recording in which Haley explained the logic behind the Miranda Project. Hale said he wanted a woman he could use whenever and however he wanted, and when he was tired or bored, he wanted to put her away. With that final glimpse into Hale's mind, the defense rested. Everett Price delivered the prosecution's final closing argument. He reminded the jury of the evidence and asked them to return a guilty verdict. Then the trial took a surprising turn. After hearing the prosecution summarize the case against him, Darren Kwan filed a handwritten motion demanding the right to testify. When his attorney tried to stop him, Kwan threatened to fire him. Against the advice of his lawyers, Kwan took the witness stand. The courtroom was stunned. The accused serial killer, charged with killing multiple people, was now going to speak in his own defense. Deputy Public Defender Ross Clay decided to address the testimony of Nolan Graves directly. He asked Kwan whether he had told Graves that he shot Mira Cole and Cassidy Blair while they were handcuffed and blindfolded. Kwan denied it. He admitted helping imprison the women, but insisted he never intended to hurt or kill them. Clay went through every statement Kwan had allegedly made to Graves. Kwan denied them all. Then Clay asked Kwan to explain the prosecution's key evidence, the videotape. On the tape, Mira Cole begged Kwan not to take her baby away. Kwan had made a cruel remark suggesting the baby was better off dead. When asked why he said it, Kwan claimed he did not know. He said the words came out in the heat of the moment and that he did not even remember saying some of the things until he saw the transcript. The videotapes had been transcribed during extradition proceedings, so every word could be understood. When Vivian Hart cross-examined Kwan, she used those transcripts to turn his own words against him. She asked whether he remembered Graves testifying that Kwan had told him the sounds of handcuffs could be heard on the tape. Kwan remembered the statement. Hart pointed out that the sound of handcuffs was not described in the printed transcript. That meant Graves could have known about it only if Kwan had told him. Despite Kwan's denials, Hart showed the jury that he had shared details with Graves that Graves could not have known otherwise. Hart then worked to prove that Kwan was not a bystander, but a willing participant. She replayed the scene showing Kwan cutting Mira Cole's shirt. She asked whether Hale had instructed him to do it. Kwan admitted he had decided on his own. Hart also played a portion of the tape in which Kwan told Hale that the piece was on the table. Kwan admitted he meant the gun. He claimed he was warning Hale in case Cassidy tried to grab it and shoot him. Hart pointed out that Cassidy was handcuffed, restrained, and outnumbered by 2 men. Kwan's explanation made little sense. Hart had shown the jury that Kwan was more than an observer. He made his own choices. At times, he even directed Hale. Because Kwan testified after the prosecution had already closed, the judge allowed prosecutors to make another closing argument. Hart told the jury that Kwan never accepted blame. He always shifted responsibility to someone else. He was not under Nolan Hale's control, she argued. He was his own person, making independent choices and doing what he wanted to do. Sterling Ward then delivered the defense's final argument. He insisted the prosecution had failed to prove its case. He attacked the videotape, saying that no matter how many times the prosecution played it, the jury never saw anyone being murdered. They saw Kwan cutting Mira's clothes, which was offensive and disturbing, but the defense argued that it was not proof of murder. Darren Kwan had been charged with the murders of men, women, and children. His fate now rested with the jury. For prosecutors, there is never such a thing as a sure verdict. The burden is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and all jurors must agree. The jury deliberated for a long time. Media coverage intensified as the days passed. Prosecutors became increasingly concerned. The longer deliberations continued, the more they feared the jury might be struggling with the circumstantial nature of the case. If the jurors demanded direct physical proof linking Kwan to each murder, he could walk free. All the prosecution could do was wait. At last, the jury informed the judge that it had reached a decision. Prosecutors had presented dozens of witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. Now the verdict would be read. The jury found Darren Kwan guilty of nearly all the first-degree murder counts. They could not reach a decision on one count, believing there was not enough evidence to convict him in that death. Darren Kwan was sentenced to death. For the prosecution, the long ordeal was finally over. Everett Price felt relief for the people of Calaveras County. After so many years, Kwan had finally been found guilty of the murders. Price was proud to have been the district attorney who carried the case to the end. After everyone else had fallen away, he was the last person standing from Calaveras County. With a final cost of more than $20 million, one of the longest and most expensive criminal cases in California history came to a close. For more than a decade, the prosecution never gave up its pursuit of justice. Darren Kwan remained on California's death row,